The courtroom was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional click of a reporter's camera. Rows of people filled every bench, some leaning forward anxiously, others sitting stiffly, unsure what to expect from the unfolding trial. On the left side of the room, in full dress blues, stood the defendant, a young Marine, his wrists bound in steel cuffs that glinted under the fluorescent lights. His posture was perfectly straight, his jaw locked in a display of military discipline, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. There was pain there, a quiet storm of confusion, injustice, and the unmistakable sense of betrayal. His name was whispered around the courtroom, some remembering him as the war hero featured on the news years earlier. Others recalled only the headlines of his arrest, twisted words suggesting treason, insubordination, and unauthorized actions in the field. But now, as people saw him in the flesh, the reality of what they were witnessing became harder to reconcile with the stories they had heard. He didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a soldier who had given everything. Behind him, his family sat in quiet devastation. His mother held a crumpled tissue in her trembling hand, eyes red from nights of crying. His father sat beside her, jaw clenched, arms crossed tightly over his chest as if physically holding himself together. To their left sat his younger brother, also in uniform, fists clenched, eyes locked on the judge as if silently willing him to see the truth. All of them had waited months for this hearing, not for a trial, but for an answer. For a flicker of justice. For a voice to speak up and ask the question they had all been screaming inside. On the opposite bench, the prosecution team shuffled their notes, composed but clearly under tension. The lead prosecutor avoided eye contact with the Marine, focusing instead on the paperwork, trying to maintain the narrative that had brought them to this point. It was a fragile structure now, held together not by truth, but by silence and omission. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, sat behind the bench scanning through a thick file. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose as he turned another page, pausing with a furrowed brow. He leaned back slowly, one hand thoughtfully resting on his chin. Something didn't add up. He could see the inconsistencies buried in the testimonies. He could feel the unease in the room. The file didn't paint the picture the prosecution had promised. The Marine stood quietly during it all. He had not spoken a word since the hearing began. His lawyer had advised him to remain silent unless asked, and he had complied, not out of fear but from years of drilled obedience. But the silence weighed heavily now, not just on him, but on everyone in the room. It was the silence of someone who had been screaming inside for far too long. When the judge finally broke the silence, his voice cut through the courtroom like a hammer. He closed the file, looked up slowly, and said in a tone that carried both confusion and anger, "Why is this Marine still in jail?" The room froze. No one moved. Even the bailiff glanced up, caught off guard by the judge's blunt question. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. The Marine's family looked up in stunned silence. His mother covered her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. His brother's jaw dropped. The prosecution team exchanged panicked glances, suddenly scrambling to come up with a response. The judge didn't ask for argument. He didn't ask for facts. He demanded an explanation, and there was none they could offer that would withstand the weight of the truth that was just beginning to surface. The question hung in the air, heavier than any sentence that had been spoken in the courtroom that day. It wasn't just about legal procedure anymore. It wasn't about military protocol or classified missions. It was about humanity. About justice. About a system that had somehow turned on the very person it was supposed to protect. The judge's words rang louder than any gavel. And in that moment, everything began to change. The tension that had seized the courtroom after the judge's startling question didn't dissipate, it thickened. Everyone remained still, as if moving might snap the fragile thread holding the moment together. The judge stared directly at the prosecution bench, his eyes sharp and unyielding, demanding a response. His tone hadn't been theatrical or emotional, but it carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had seen enough and wasn't willing to tolerate injustice for 1 second longer. The prosecutor hesitated. He looked down at his papers, shuffled them pointlessly, then adjusted his tie in an attempt to buy time. The question had not been rhetorical. It was a challenge, one that exposed the shaky ground beneath the prosecution's entire case. After a long pause, he finally stood, voice tight, "Your Honor, the charges." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "No, I'm not asking for the charges again. I've read them. I've read the field report. I've read the testimony. And none of it explains why this man, a decorated Marine with a spotless service record, is sitting here in shackles like a criminal. The courtroom reacted with another ripple of hushed murmurs. Some spectators turned to one another, nodding, as if they too had wondered the same but hadn't dared speak it aloud. Others sat wide-eyed, stunned that a judge, someone with real power, was voicing what so many had silently questioned for months. The Marine, still standing tall, allowed the slightest flicker of expression to cross his face. It wasn't hope, exactly. More like the faintest recognition that, for the first time in a long while, someone was actually listening. His lawyer shifted beside him, clearly not expecting the judge to be this direct this early. He had planned for a long battle. But now, things were moving fast, and in their favor. The judge removed his glasses and leaned forward. His voice dropped in volume but intensified in weight. This man was deployed overseas. He operated under orders, in hostile territory. He made a decision that saved lives, American lives, and yet, according to this file, he was arrested upon return, denied a proper review, and has spent the last several months in confinement while the government drags its feet on declassifying basic mission details. He looked down, flipping through the documents again, though it was clear he didn't need to reread anything. He was building to something. Everyone could feel it. I've served in this court for over 2 decades, he continued. And I've seen criminals walk free on technicalities. I've seen soldiers punished for errors made in the fog of war. But what I see here isn't justice. It's a cover-up disguised as procedure. The Marine's mother broke down quietly in the gallery. She tried to remain composed, but the sight of someone finally defending her son was too much. Her sobs were soft but audible, drawing sympathetic glances from nearby attendees. The Marine's brother reached over and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, though his own face was tight with emotion. The prosecutor tried again, this time more cautiously. Your Honor, the full context of the mission has not yet been declassified. We are awaiting clearance from the Department of Defense, and until then, And in the meantime, the judge snapped, you're content to keep this man locked in a cell as though he's guilty of war crimes. When what I see here reads more like he was thrown under the bus for doing his job. The prosecutor opened his mouth but found no words. He glanced at his team, then back at the floor. The silence returned, more damning than before. The judge sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Let me be very clear, I will not let bureaucracy be used as a weapon. This Marine has served his country. And unless you present hard evidence that justifies stripping him of his freedom, I will move to have him released, today. The room stirred again, this time louder, more energized. The defense attorney looked at the Marine with renewed confidence. The courtroom, once tense with hopeless expectation, now vibrated with the possibility of a turning tide. It was clear something was happening that no one had anticipated. The system, rigid and cold, had suddenly bent, if only slightly, under the weight of truth. And the man in the uniform, who had stood alone for so long, was no longer standing alone. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow valley, ricocheting off mud brick walls and dry rock. Dust swirled violently in the scorching Afghan heat as boots pounded the earth, soldiers shouting commands over the chaos. It was supposed to be a routine patrol through a small, reportedly neutral village nestled near the Kandahar border. Intelligence had shown no hostile presence in the area, just civilians, mostly farmers and their families. But within minutes of arrival, the team was ambushed from 2 sides. They had walked straight into a trap. The Marine, then a sergeant and squad leader, was at the front when it started. The first explosion knocked out the Humvee behind them, flames billowing into the sky as the vehicle flipped onto its side. 2 of his men went down immediately. His instincts kicked in faster than thought. He signaled his team to take cover and returned fire, dragging one wounded soldier behind a wall as rounds pierced the air inches from his head. Screams filled the air, not just from Marines, but from villagers caught in the crossfire. Women and children scrambled for cover, some crying out for help in languages the Americans didn't understand but didn't need to. Panic spoke louder than words. From his vantage point behind a crumbling stone wall, the Marine saw them, a group of Taliban fighters using civilians as shields while firing from the rooftop of a mosque. His radio crackled with static-laced orders. The command was clear: fall back, regroup, request air support. But he saw something the officers back at the base couldn't, civilians pinned down and about to be slaughtered. He made a call. Against orders, he led 3 of his men into the village's side alley, flanking the enemy position. Moving quickly, they breached a compound, neutralized 2 insurgents, and cleared a path for the trapped civilians to escape. A young boy clung to his mother's leg, too frozen to run, until the Marine scooped him up with one arm and sprinted to safety under a hail of bullets. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for backup. He acted. In the process, he lost one of his own, Corporal Dean, shot in the neck during the push. The Marine carried him out on his back, blood soaking through both of their uniforms, refusing to leave him behind. He coordinated the medical evacuation himself, refusing to let grief or exhaustion cloud his judgment. Air support finally arrived 10 minutes later, dropping ordnance that ended the ambush. But the damage was done. Back at the base, the Marine filed a full report. He expected debriefs, maybe a reprimand for disobeying a direct order, but nothing more. After all, his actions had saved over a dozen civilians and likely prevented the deaths of half his squad. But the mood shifted. Quickly. Higher-ups were uncomfortable with the details of his decision-making. The mosque was damaged in the firefight, a fact the local government found politically sensitive. A drone had captured partial footage of the operation, lacking context, but enough to raise eyebrows. Questions turned to accusations. His chain of command became tight-lipped. The mission was suddenly classified. He was told to stay quiet. No formal charges were filed, at first. Then came the investigation, quiet and internal. His security clearance was revoked. His deployment was cut short. And without ever being given a chance to defend himself in full, he was arrested stateside under vague terms, unlawful conduct during active combat. The memory of that day never left him. In his cell, he could still smell the dust, feel the weight of Dean's body slung over his shoulders, hear the crack of rifles and the desperate cries of villagers. What haunted him most wasn't the violence, it was the silence that followed. The silence from those who should have had his back. The silence from a system that demanded sacrifice but looked away when its consequences became inconvenient. And now, as he stood in the courtroom, shackled and judged, that day in the Afghan valley pulsed through his mind. Not with pride, not with regret, but with a quiet, aching question: when did doing the right thing become the wrong choice? The atmosphere in the courtroom remained electric, still humming with the weight of the judge's explosive question. But just as attention had turned toward the stunned prosecution, something unexpected happened. From the third row of the gallery, a woman stood up quietly. She was dressed modestly, in a black blazer and jeans, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Around her neck hung a press badge. She was a journalist, one of the many attending what had become a highly publicized hearing. But unlike the others, she wasn't holding a notepad or snapping photos. Instead, she was holding a small flash drive in her right hand, clutching it as if it were made of glass. She stepped forward, cautiously but with purpose, and addressed the defense attorney in a low voice, just above a whisper. The courtroom noticed. The Marine's lawyer turned to her, surprised, and leaned in to hear her words. Her voice, though soft, carried conviction. This wasn't supposed to be buried. This footage was smuggled out of the base. You need to play it now. The attorney hesitated only a moment before nodding. He stepped forward and addressed the judge, his voice steady but with a new urgency. Your Honor, we've just been handed new video evidence by a member of the press. I believe it's relevant to the charges in question. With your permission, I'd like to enter it into the record and play it now. The judge gave a curt nod. Proceed. A bailiff escorted the flash drive to the courtroom technician, who inserted it into the evidence computer connected to the display monitor facing the courtroom. The screen flickered to life. The footage was raw, unedited, shaky in parts. It was body cam footage, time-stamped, clearly taken during the mission the Marine was being court-martialed for. But what it revealed was nothing short of jaw-dropping. The first few seconds showed the chaotic environment of the ambush, bullets flying, smoke billowing, soldiers ducking behind walls, shouting to one another. Then came the Marine. The camera caught him taking command, leading with controlled urgency, dragging wounded soldiers to safety, guiding terrified civilians, many of them children, away from danger. It also showed the enemy combatants firing from the mosque, using the building as a stronghold, a blatant violation of international law. And then it showed the moment he defied the retreat order, broke formation, and charged in with 2 other Marines to rescue the trapped villagers. Every action was precise, deliberate. There was no rage, no recklessness, only purpose. A field medic's voice could be heard in the background yelling, "We'd all be dead if it wasn't for him." The video ended with footage of the Marine carrying the fallen Corporal Dean, bloodied and limp, across open ground, taking bullets to his vest as he refused to let the body fall. When the screen went black, the courtroom sat frozen in stunned silence. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the sound of a pen scratching against paper. The Marine's mother wept openly now, but this time not out of grief. This time, she cried because the truth had finally spoken for itself. The prosecution sat stone-faced, the lead attorney visibly pale, fingers twitching nervously on the table. The judge turned slowly toward the prosecution. His voice, when he finally spoke, was filled with restrained fury. "Was this footage withheld from discovery? Or were you unaware it existed?" The prosecutor scrambled to respond. "Your Honor, this was not provided by the Department of Defense, and we were not informed." "That's not what I asked," the judge interrupted, voice rising slightly. "I asked if it was withheld. Intentionally. I can't confirm that at this time." The judge leaned back, unimpressed. "Then I suggest someone in your chain of command has a great deal to answer for." The journalist, still standing in the gallery, was now being approached by 2 court officers, one of whom took her name and press credentials. She handed them over calmly, her eyes fixed not on the judge, nor the prosecution, but on the Marine. He met her gaze with quiet gratitude. He didn't smile. He never did. But there was a flicker of something else. A spark that hadn't been there before. The beginning of hope. The defense attorney stood tall now, confidence returning. "This video makes it clear, Your Honor. My client did not act unlawfully. He acted heroically. He saved American lives, Afghan civilians, and upheld the integrity of our forces when others hesitated. This isn't misconduct. It's courage." The courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a battlefield reclaimed, one where the truth had finally broken through the fog. Just as the weight of the newly revealed video footage settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog lifting, a low, gravelly voice from the back pierced the silence. "Your Honor," it said firmly. Heads turned as a tall, older man in a worn gray suit and thick-rimmed glasses stood slowly from the back row. There was something about him, his posture, the calm authority in his voice, that commanded immediate attention. He moved toward the front of the courtroom with no hesitation, holding a black leather folder tight to his chest. The bailiff instinctively moved to stop him, but the judge raised his hand, eyeing the man closely. "State your name and why you are interrupting court proceedings," the judge ordered. The man stopped a few feet from the bench. "My name is David Kent. I'm a former CIA field officer. Retired. Clearance code Echo 27 Delta." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Go on," he said, his tone cautious. Kent took a deep breath and opened the folder. "I've been watching this case unfold from the shadows like everyone else. I was involved in operations connected to this Marine's deployment. What's been presented so far is only part of the story. The rest of it has been buried under layers of red tape, all in the name of national security." He looked over at the Marine. "But I was there. I know exactly what this man was ordered to do, and more importantly, I know why he was ordered to do it." The courtroom was utterly silent now, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Kent stepped closer to the bench and handed the folder to the judge. Inside were sealed documents bearing the unmistakable markings of classified material, code words, operation names, mission briefings, all heavily redacted but still potent. "These orders were signed off by Joint Special Operations Command," Kent explained. "They authorized non-standard engagement protocols due to a high-value target believed to be embedded in that village. That target was using civilians as cover. The Marine here followed a split directive: secure civilians while locating the target. That conflict in orders wasn't communicated clearly to all levels of command, and when things went sideways, he became the fall guy." The judge scanned the top document, his brow deepening with every line. His lips tightened into a frown. Why wasn't any of this disclosed before now? He asked without looking up. Kent sighed. Because officially, the operation doesn't exist. The mission was reclassified after it went wrong. Higher-ups didn't want diplomatic fallout. So they pulled the footage, scrubbed the mission logs, and left him to carry the blame. I shouldn't even be speaking about this, but watching him sit in that cage while the real story stays hidden, it's not right. The prosecutor tried to object, but his voice faltered. The judge raised a hand again, silencing him before he could finish. He turned to Kent, his voice deliberate. Do you have the authority to authenticate these documents? I do, Kent said without hesitation. And I'll testify to their origin under oath. The judge closed the folder slowly, processing the enormity of what had just been laid before him. Then this case has taken a very serious turn, he said. Because if these documents are what they appear to be, not only has this Marine been wrongfully imprisoned, he's been sacrificed to cover up a politically inconvenient truth. The judge stood. This court will recess for 1 hour while I review these documents in chambers. Mr. Kent, you will remain available for questioning under oath. Defense counsel, prepare to file an immediate motion for dismissal and release. The Marine stood motionless, his face unreadable, but his hands, no longer shaking, were finally still. It wasn't vindication yet, but it was the first real crack in the walls that had imprisoned him. As the judge exited the bench, Kent turned to the Marine and gave him a slow nod of respect. You did your job, he said quietly. Now it's time someone did theirs. As the courtroom emptied for the judge's recess, the Marine's family remained seated, too stunned to move. For so long, they had lived in a state of suspended grief, mourning a son who was still alive, but buried beneath disgrace, rumors, and a system that refused to listen. Now, something had changed. The silence that had haunted them was cracking, letting light filter through in beams too powerful to ignore. His mother sat motionless at first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Then she broke. Her shoulders trembled and she lowered her head, sobs shaking her body. She tried to keep it quiet, as she always had, for the sake of strength, for the sake of appearance. But this time, there was no reason to hide. Her grief wasn't for shame anymore. It was for release. For the months spent begging for someone, anyone, to believe her son. For the countless nights she had stayed awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone so wrong in a world where a hero could be called a criminal. Beside her, the Marine's younger brother sat stiff as a board, hands clenched into fists on his knees. He had always looked up to his older brother, followed him into service, wore his uniform with pride, even when people whispered at the base or looked at their family with pity. But seeing his brother stand in shackles while the world judged him had planted something dark in his chest. Anger, distrust, and worst of all, doubt. But now, as the footage had played, and the former CIA agent spoke with fire in his voice, that doubt began to dissolve. The truth didn't just clear his brother's name, it gave him back his foundation. A pillar he had feared was forever broken. He looked over at his mother and finally reached for her hand. She gripped it tightly, like a lifeline. Across the aisle, other spectators were talking in hushed tones, the tone of the room entirely transformed. The energy had shifted. Reporters whispered to one another, frantically typing notes, glancing at the Marine like they were seeing him for the first time, not as a defendant but as something closer to what he really was. A man who had risked everything and been left behind. The Marine stood near the defense table, still under watch by the bailiff but no longer surrounded by hostility. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear, probably about the next steps, the motion for dismissal, what could happen in an hour. But the Marine didn't react much. He gave a small nod, eyes focused ahead, as if still watching a battle no one else could see. It was hard for anyone to understand what it felt like to carry months, years, of accusation in silence, only to see the wall of lies begin to crumble in real time. A veteran in the gallery stood up and approached the Marine's mother. He was old, with a cane and a jacket covered in pins, Vietnam, Korea, and a Purple Heart. He didn't say anything, just reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. She looked up, tear-streaked and exhausted, and the man nodded. "He did good," he said softly. "We all saw it." Others in the courtroom began doing the same, small gestures of acknowledgement. A woman in uniform saluted quietly from her seat. A young man wiped his eyes. Even one of the court officers, standing at the back, looked down with a faint shake of his head, as if ashamed he'd once believed what he'd been told about the case. It was more than a shift in public opinion. It was a reckoning, an emotional tide, turning against months of silence, cover-ups, and willful blindness. The Marine's family wasn't celebrating, not yet. But for the first time since the arrest, they didn't feel alone. The shame they had carried was no longer theirs to bear. As the court staff began filtering back in, preparing for the judge's return, the Marine turned slightly toward the gallery. His eyes met his mother's. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her face. But her look said what words couldn't. "We see you. We know who you are. And now, they do too." The gavel struck the block with a heavy finality as the judge returned to the bench. The courtroom, now filled once more, had gone utterly still. The Marine stood again, shoulders squared, hands still cuffed in front of him, though something in his bearing had changed. His posture was no longer just military discipline, it was defiance softened by exhaustion, the stance of a man who had stood accused for too long and was ready to face whatever came next. His lawyer stood beside him, eyes fixed on the bench, prepared for either a breakthrough or a bitter delay. The judge took a long moment before speaking. He removed his glasses and folded them on the desk. His expression had shifted, no longer skeptical or simply confused, but resolute. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of outrage beneath it. "I have reviewed the submitted documents, the video footage, and the testimony given today," he began. "And what I see is a deeply troubling failure, not on the part of this Marine, but on the part of the system that was supposed to protect and honor him." He glanced toward the prosecution bench, where the attorneys sat rigid, their earlier confidence now replaced with a grim recognition that they were rapidly losing control. The judge turned back to the courtroom. "This man," he said, gesturing to the Marine, "was sent into a hostile environment under a flawed and fragmented chain of command. He acted to save lives, both civilian and military, at great personal risk. He did so while following a set of orders that were later buried under classification and used against him. This court cannot, in good conscience, continue this charade." A ripple moved through the gallery, gasps, quiet sighs, the sound of someone stifling a cry. The judge's voice grew sharper. "This court finds that there was insufficient basis for detention, and that the arrest and continued confinement of this Marine constitute a gross miscarriage of justice. Accordingly, I am ordering the immediate dismissal of all charges and the release of the defendant from custody." The words struck like a bell. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers. At first, there was just silence, stunned and powerful. The kind of silence that follows something sacred. Then, slowly, the sound of applause began to grow. It started with a few claps in the back, hesitant at first, then swelling into a full wave of thunderous respect. The Marine's mother broke down again, this time weeping openly into her son's brother's shoulder. The lawyer exhaled hard, allowing a rare smile to crease his face. Even the judge's eyes softened slightly as he looked down at the Marine. The bailiff stepped forward and carefully removed the handcuffs from the Marine's wrists. The metal clinked against itself as they were unlocked, an unceremonious sound, but one that felt like the collapse of a wall. The Marine rubbed his wrists gently, but said nothing. He simply looked up at the judge and nodded, a quiet gesture of acknowledgement and restrained gratitude. The judge stood. "Let the record show that this man should never have been put in chains. He deserves our respect, not our suspicion. Court is adjourned." With that, he turned and exited through the judge's door, leaving a room full of people trying to catch their breath. Reporters leapt to their feet, scrambling to relay the decision, phones lighting up across the room as news outlets and social media picked up the story. The same headlines that once condemned the Marine were now being rewritten in real time. The Marine turned slowly to face the gallery. His mother stood, still crying, but smiling now, her hands trembling. She didn't run to him, she knew he didn't like public displays, but her eyes were locked on his, and he read everything she felt in that single glance. His brother approached him, standing before him in uniform, then raised his hand to his forehead and offered a slow, deliberate salute. The Marine paused, then returned the salute, just as slow, just as meaningful. The room continued to buzz around them, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. The man who had been branded a traitor, imprisoned without justice, and nearly erased from the truth, now stood free. Not because someone had rescued him, but because the truth had finally fought its way to the surface, and this time, the system had listened. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd had gathered, kept at a respectful distance by a few officers and a rope barrier. Some were reporters with cameras and microphones ready, others were veterans, supporters, and strangers who had followed the case from afar and had come hoping for justice, or at least a sign that justice still meant something. By the time the Marine stepped through the courthouse doors, accompanied by his lawyer and flanked by security, the mid-afternoon sun cast a golden light over the scene, making the polished brass buttons of his dress blues shimmer with each step. There was a split second of quiet. The moment his boots touched the final step, silence fell again, just long enough for everyone to recognize the magnitude of what was happening. Then it broke, not into chaos, not into protest, but into a deep, thunderous wave of applause. People stood, clapped, saluted. A group of veterans near the front, some with canes, others in wheelchairs, rose as best they could and offered salutes with tears in their eyes. A man who had served in the Gulf War held up a sign, "You didn't fail us. We failed you." A young woman cradling a baby mouthed, "Thank you," through her tears. It wasn't just admiration in the air, it was remorse. Redemption. Collective guilt unraveling and reweaving itself into a thread of dignity. The Marine stopped at the edge of the steps. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He stood tall and looked out over the crowd, his expression unreadable but powerful. His hands, no longer bound, were clenched tightly at his sides, not out of anger, but from sheer emotional containment. A storm was still inside him, and now the world was finally quiet enough to hear it. His mother and brother joined him on the steps. She took his arm gently, not pulling him forward, but anchoring him. Her tears had not stopped, but her chin was lifted high. Beside her, the younger brother stood in full uniform, jaw tight, pride radiating from his eyes as he scanned the faces of those who had once doubted, now offering cheers and support. Cameras clicked. Reporters shouted questions, but the Marine said nothing. The lawyer leaned over and whispered, "You don't have to say a word. They already know." The Marine nodded once, eyes scanning the American flag flying above the courthouse. It flapped steadily in the wind, the same flag he had saluted countless times on foreign soil, the same flag that draped the coffin of his fallen friend, Corporal Dean. That flag still meant something to him, but now, its meaning was different. Not perfect, not pure, but real. A young boy squeezed through the crowd with his father's help. He held a small homemade sign that said, "Welcome home, hero." The Marine noticed. He stepped down from the courthouse steps and walked toward the boy, who looked up at him with wide, awed eyes. The father tried to apologize, but the Marine shook his head and knelt. He didn't say much, just smiled faintly and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You take care of your dad," he said softly. The boy nodded, clutching the sign tighter. The Marine turned back to the crowd, raising one hand in a quiet, firm wave, not to claim attention, but to acknowledge everyone who had finally seen him clearly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. He didn't need speeches. He didn't need medals. He needed the truth, and for the first time in months, the world had given it back to him. Slowly, he walked toward the edge of the courthouse grounds, flanked by his family, greeted by strangers who now offered respect where suspicion once lived. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, no longer a place of judgment, but the site of his release. He didn't walk like a man seeking vengeance or validation. He walked like a man who had survived something few could understand.